In 1973, a single afternoon changed the course of Atlanta's criminal history forever. 3 men walked into a downtown credit union with nothing but determination and a meticulously crafted plan. Within 27 minutes, they had vanished with $3.1 million in cash, bonds, and precious metals. No alarms sounded, no witnesses came forward, no arrests followed. The case went cold before the ink dried on the police reports, and for 36 years the truth remained buried beneath layers of silence and misdirection. But in 2009, when an elderly couple in suburban Decatur called a furnace repair company to fix their heating system, a routine maintenance job became the key that unlocked one of the South's most perfectly executed heists. What the repairman found behind a false wall wasn't just money. It was evidence of a crime so precisely planned that investigators had spent decades chasing shadows, while the real perpetrators lived quietly among them. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. On the morning of August 14, 1973, the Peachtree Federal Credit Union on Marietta Street buzzed with its usual Tuesday activity. Located in the heart of Atlanta's financial district, the institution served primarily government employees and municipal workers. The building itself was unremarkable, a modest 2-story brick structure wedged between a dry cleaner and a small accounting firm. What made it valuable wasn't its appearance but its contents. The credit union held substantial cash reserves, municipal bonds, and a collection of safety deposit boxes that housed everything from family heirlooms to small business reserves. The morning shift began at 8:30 with 4 employees present. Margaret Coleman, the head teller, had worked there for 12 years and knew every regular customer by name. Behind the counter, 2 junior tellers processed routine transactions while the branch manager, Robert Hayes, reviewed loan applications in his corner office. The security was minimal by modern standards, but typical for the era. A single guard, posted near the front entrance, monitored foot traffic and checked identification for safety deposit box access. At exactly 11:47 a.m., 3 men entered through the main door. They wore dark business suits, carried leather briefcases, and moved with the confident stride of professionals. The guard barely glanced up as they approached the counter. One of the men, tall with graying temples, presented what appeared to be federal identification and spoke quietly to Margaret Coleman. He explained that they were conducting a routine audit of municipal accounts and needed access to the vault records immediately. Coleman hesitated. The identification looked authentic, but she had received no advance notice of any inspection. The man remained calm, patient, and produced a second document bearing official seals. He mentioned specific account numbers and referenced recent federal banking regulations that Coleman recognized from trade publications. His knowledge of internal procedures was precise, almost intimate. After a brief consultation with Manager Hayes, who emerged from his office to examine the credentials, Coleman agreed to escort them to the secure area. What happened next unfolded with surgical precision. Once inside the vault area, the 3 men dropped their professional facade. The tall man produced a small handgun while his companions quickly restrained Coleman and Hayes with plastic zip ties. No voices were raised. No threats were issued. The entire transition from legitimate audit to armed robbery took less than 90 seconds. The men worked methodically, targeting specific areas with obvious familiarity. They bypassed the smaller cash drawers and headed directly to the high-value storage sections. One man focused on the municipal bond certificates, carefully selecting only the most liquid securities. Another opened a series of safety deposit boxes using tools that suggested either locksmith training or extensive preparation. The third maintained watch while systematically emptying cash reserves from multiple vault compartments. their selection process revealed deep inside knowledge. They avoided registered bonds that could be easily traced and focused on bearer certificates that functioned essentially as cash. They ignored jewelry and personal items from safety deposit boxes, taking only currency, gold coins, and negotiable securities. Every movement was deliberate, efficient, and informed by someone who understood both the credit union's procedures and the broader financial system. The entire operation lasted 27 minutes. As quietly as they had entered, the three men gathered their materials into their briefcases and prepared to leave. Coleman and Hayes remained bound but unharmed in the vault area. The guard at the front desk had been similarly restrained, though he later admitted to investigators that he hadn't realized anything was wrong until the men had already departed. No shots were fired. No violence occurred beyond the initial restraint of the staff. Before leaving, the tall man made a final gesture that would puzzle investigators for decades. He returned to where Coleman sat and apologized for the inconvenience, explaining that they had no choice and that no one would be hurt if the police were notified after a reasonable delay. He even loosened her restraint slightly, ensuring she could free herself within an hour. The politeness was unsettling, professional, and entirely at odds with the crime being committed. The men exited through the same front door they had entered. A witness across the street later reported seeing three individuals in business attire walking calmly toward a dark sedan parked half a block away. The license plate was noted, but later proved to be stolen. The vehicle itself was found abandoned in an industrial area 3 days later, stripped of all identifying features and wiped clean of fingerprints. Discovery of the robbery came exactly as the perpetrators had planned. Coleman managed to free herself after 45 minutes and immediately alerted authorities. The Atlanta Police Department responded within minutes, followed quickly by federal agents due to the involvement of government funds. The crime scene was pristine, almost clinically clean. No fingerprints, no physical evidence, no witnesses who could provide useful descriptions. Initial estimates placed the loss at approximately $800,000, but as investigators conducted a thorough inventory, the true scope became clear. The thieves had taken $3.1 million in various forms, making it one of the largest cash thefts in Georgia history at that time. More disturbing than the amount was the precision of the selection. They had taken only items that were difficult to trace and easy to liquidate, suggesting someone with extensive knowledge of financial instruments and law enforcement tracking methods. The federal investigation launched immediately, led by Special Agent David Brennan of the FBI's Atlanta field office. Brennan had worked financial crimes for over a decade and recognized the sophistication of the operation. This wasn't a desperate grab for quick cash, but a carefully orchestrated extraction, executed by individuals with professional training and inside information. The politeness toward the victims, the surgical precision of the theft, and the clean escape all pointed to a level of planning that impressed even seasoned investigators. Early theories focused on the obvious suspects. Current and former employees were investigated extensively. Security companies with access to the building came under scrutiny. Federal agents examined recent personnel changes, financial irregularities among staff members, and any connections to known criminal organizations. Every lead produced dead ends. The credit union's employees all had solid alibis and clean financial records. Security personnel showed no signs of sudden wealth or suspicious behavior. The investigation expanded to examine similar crimes across the Southeast, looking for patterns or connections. While several other financial institutions had been robbed during the same period, none displayed the same level of sophistication or inside knowledge. The Peachtree Federal Heist stood alone in its execution and success rate. As weeks turned to months, the case began to show signs of the stagnation that would define it for the next 3 decades. physical evidence remained non-existent. Witness accounts proved too vague for composite sketches. The stolen securities never appeared on any known markets, suggesting either long-term storage or disposal through channels completely outside normal criminal networks. Agent Brennan's final report, filed 6 months after the robbery, concluded that the crime had been committed by professionals with extensive planning time and probable inside assistance. However, without concrete evidence or credible leads, the case was officially suspended in 1975. The files were boxed, archived, and largely forgotten as newer cases demanded attention and resources. What the investigators never discovered was that the truth had been hiding in plain sight all along. The 3 men who walked into the Peachtree Federal Credit Union that August morning weren't career criminals or members of an organized syndicate. They were employees of the federal government itself, working within a system they understood intimately because they had helped design it. Thomas Mitchell had spent 15 years as a federal banking inspector, traveling throughout the Southeast to audit credit unions and small banks. His official role gave him unprecedented access to security procedures, vault layouts, and cash handling protocols. He knew which institutions held the highest reserves when they received large deposits and how their internal controls functioned. More importantly, he understood the gaps in those controls, the brief windows of vulnerability that existed in even the most secure facilities. Mitchell's partners were equally well-positioned. Robert Chen worked for the Treasury Department's regional office, specializing in the tracking and verification of government securities. His expertise with bonds, certificates, and negotiable instruments made him invaluable in identifying which items could be taken without triggering immediate alerts. The third man, James Crawford, served as a liaison between federal agencies and local financial institutions. His job required him to maintain relationships with managers, understand personnel schedules, and coordinate various regulatory activities. The plan had begun forming nearly 2 years before the actual robbery. Mitchell had been conducting routine inspections at the Peachtree Federal Credit Union and noticed several procedural irregularities that, while not necessarily violations, created potential security vulnerabilities. Instead of reporting these issues through official channels, he began documenting them privately. The more he studied the credit union's operations, the more he realized how easily the system could be exploited by someone with his level of access and knowledge. The conspiracy expanded when Mitchell shared his observations with Chen during a routine interagency meeting in early 1972. Chen's initial reaction was professional curiosity, but as Mitchell outlined the specific vulnerabilities he had identified, the conversation took a darker turn. Both men were facing financial pressures that their government salaries couldn't address. Mitchell was supporting his elderly parents and paying for his daughter's medical treatments. Chen had accumulated significant gambling debts that threatened to destroy his career if discovered. Crawford joined the conspiracy several months later, recruited after Mitchell observed his growing frustration with federal bureaucracy and his frequent complaints about inadequate compensation. Crawford's role would be crucial in providing logistical support and ensuring that any investigation would focus on external threats rather than internal possibilities. The preparation phase consumed 18 months of careful observation and rehearsal. Mitchell conducted legitimate inspections at the credit union 4 separate times, each visit allowing him to refine his understanding of the facility's routines and security measures. He memorized the vault layout, identified the most valuable holdings, and determined the optimal timing for an operation. Chen used his Treasury Department access to research the traceability of various securities held at the credit union, creating a target list of items that could be liquidated without immediate detection. Crawford's contribution was equally methodical. He established relationships with credit union staff, learning their personal schedules, habits, and procedures. His friendly demeanor and official status made him a welcome visitor, someone who could ask detailed questions about operations without arousing suspicion. He also arranged for several legitimate federal inspections at nearby institutions during the same time period, creating a pattern that would make the August 14th visit appear routine. The psychological preparation was as important as the logistical planning. All three men were career government employees with no criminal backgrounds. They understood that success would depend not just on executing the robbery, but on maintaining their normal lives and professional responsibilities afterward. They practiced their roles extensively, rehearsing the transition from federal inspectors to armed robbers until the shift felt natural and controlled. On the morning of the heist, everything proceeded according to their meticulous plan. Mitchell's federal credentials were genuine, as were the documents he presented to Margaret Coleman. His knowledge of banking regulations and specific account details was authentic because he had acquired it through legitimate channels during previous inspections. The confidence he displayed wasn't an act, but the natural bearing of someone performing duties he had executed dozens of times before. The restraint shown toward the credit union staff reflected careful calculation rather than compassion. Violence would have escalated the federal response and increased the likelihood of a thorough investigation. By keeping the robbery clean and professional, they hoped to blend it into the background of routine financial crimes that rarely received sustained attention from federal agencies already stretched thin across multiple jurisdictions. The selection of items to steal demonstrated their sophisticated understanding of the financial system. Bearer bonds and negotiable securities were chosen specifically because they functioned like currency, but weren't subject to the same tracking mechanisms as cash. Gold coins and precious metals were portable, valuable, and difficult to trace once separated from their original documentation. Everything they took was selected to maximize value while minimizing the risk of detection during liquidation. Their escape plan was equally well conceived. The stolen sedan had been acquired weeks earlier through a complex series of transactions designed to obscure its connection to them. The industrial area where it was abandoned had been scouted multiple times, chosen for its lack of surveillance cameras and minimal foot traffic. The men separated immediately after the robbery, each returning to their normal routines without any contact or communication. In the days following the heist, all three men reported to their regular jobs and performed their duties without deviation. Mitchell continued his banking inspections, even participating in discussions about the Peachtree federal robbery with colleagues. Chen processed routine Treasury Department paperwork and attended meetings about securities tracking procedures. Crawford maintained his liaison activities, expressing appropriate concern about the crime's impact on federal-local relationships. The stolen money and securities were not immediately converted or spent. Instead, they were carefully divided and hidden in separate locations, awaiting the passage of time and the inevitable cooling of the investigation. Each man understood that any sudden change in lifestyle or financial behavior would attract attention they couldn't afford. Their plan was built around patience, requiring them to live modestly while sitting on millions in stolen assets. This patience proved to be both their greatest strength and ultimately their undoing. For years, the scheme worked flawlessly. The investigation stalled, media attention faded, and the three conspirators continued their government careers without incident. Mitchell even received commendations for his thorough banking inspections. Chen was promoted within the Treasury Department. Crawford expanded his responsibilities as a federal liaison. But as the decades passed, the challenge of maintaining their secret while keeping the stolen assets secure created new pressures and complications that none of them had fully anticipated. The burden of carrying such an enormous secret began to manifest in unexpected ways as the 1980s progressed. Thomas Mitchell, once known for his meticulous attention to detail during banking inspections, started showing signs of strain that concerned his supervisors. He became increasingly paranoid about routine paperwork, double-checking procedures that had never troubled him before. His colleagues attributed the changes to the natural pressures of a demanding career, but Mitchell knew the real source of his anxiety. Every federal meeting, every discussion of financial crimes, every mention of the Peachtree federal case sent waves of fear through him. Robert Chen faced different challenges. His gambling problem, the original motivation for joining the conspiracy, had only worsened after the robbery. The irony wasn't lost on him that despite having access to millions in stolen assets, he couldn't touch any of it without risking exposure. His debts continued to mount, and the bookies who had once pressured him for payment were becoming increasingly aggressive. Several times, Chen considered revealing the location of his share of the stolen money, but the knowledge that doing so would destroy not only his life, but also the lives of his conspirators kept him silent. James Crawford proved to be the most psychologically resilient of the three, but even he struggled with the isolation that came with maintaining such a massive deception. He had always been a social person, someone who enjoyed sharing stories and building relationships with colleagues. Now, every conversation felt dangerous, every friendship potentially compromised by the secret he carried. He began withdrawing from social activities, claiming increased workload and family responsibilities that didn't actually exist. The physical storage of the stolen assets created ongoing logistical nightmares. Mitchell had initially hidden his portion in a series of safety deposit boxes across 3 different states, using false identities that he had carefully constructed over several months. The documentation required to maintain these identities, the regular travel needed to check on the boxes, and the constant fear of discovery created a level of stress that began affecting his health. By 1985, he was taking medication for high blood pressure and had developed chronic insomnia. Chen's approach had been different, but equally problematic. He had converted much of his share into gold coins and small, easily transportable securities, storing them in a climate-controlled storage unit rented under an assumed name. However, the monthly payments required to maintain the unit, the need to periodically check on the contents, and the ongoing risk that the facility might be sold or renovated created constant anxiety. He found himself driving past the storage facility at odd hours, checking for signs of unusual activity or law enforcement presence. Crawford had chosen what seemed like the safest option, constructing a hidden vault in the basement of his suburban Atlanta home. Using his government connections, he had acquired construction materials through legitimate channels and built the concealment during a supposed home renovation project. The vault was expertly hidden behind a false wall in his basement workshop, accessible only through a complex series of hidden panels and electronic locks. For years, this seemed like the perfect solution, allowing him to check on his assets whenever he wanted while maintaining complete control over access. The challenge of liquidating any portion of the stolen goods proved more complex than any of them had anticipated. The bearer bonds and securities they had specifically chosen for their untraceable nature still required sophisticated networks to convert into usable cash. None of the 3 men had connections to criminal organizations or black market dealers, and their government positions made it impossible to develop such relationships without arousing suspicion. Mitchell made the first attempt to liquidate part of his holdings in 1981, nearly 8 years after the robbery. He traveled to Miami under an assumed identity and attempted to sell several gold coins through a private dealer. The transaction went smoothly, but the amount of cash he received was far less than the item's actual value, and the entire process left him feeling exposed and vulnerable. The dealer had asked too many questions, requested too much documentation, and seemed far too interested in where the coins had originated. The experience convinced Mitchell that attempting to convert their stolen assets was more dangerous than simply leaving them untouched. He shared this conclusion with his co-conspirators during one of their rare, carefully orchestrated meetings. They agreed to continue waiting, hoping that the passage of additional time would make the items safer to liquidate, or that changes in financial regulations might create new opportunities. But waiting created its own problems. Chen's gambling debts reached a critical point in 1983 when his creditors threatened to contact his employer at the Treasury Department. Desperate, he violated the group's agreement and attempted to sell a small portion of his holdings through a different channel. He approached a coin dealer in Birmingham, Alabama, presenting himself as an estate administrator liquidating inherited items. The transaction was successful, but Chen's nervous behavior and obvious unfamiliarity with the process attracted more attention than he realized. The Birmingham dealer, suspicious of Chen's story and concerned about the quality and age of the coins being offered, made discreet inquiries with local law enforcement. While nothing immediately came of these inquiries, they created a paper trail that would prove significant years later, when federal investigators began re-examining cold cases with fresh resources and modern technology. Crawford, meanwhile, had become obsessed with the security of his hidden vault. He installed additional electronic monitoring systems, upgraded the locks multiple times, and even considered relocating the entire cache to a different location. His wife began questioning his frequent trips to the basement, his secretive behavior around home improvement projects, and his obvious stress whenever repair workers or service technicians needed access to the house. The strain on their personal relationships became another unexpected consequence of their crime. Mitchell's marriage suffered as his wife struggled to understand his increasingly withdrawn and paranoid behavior. She attributed his changes to work stress and encouraged him to consider early retirement, not knowing that leaving his government position would actually make him feel more vulnerable and exposed. Chen's family life deteriorated more dramatically. His gambling problem, combined with the psychological pressure of maintaining his secret, led to erratic behavior that alienated his wife and children. By the mid-1980s, his marriage was essentially over in all but name, with his family attributing the breakdown to his gambling addiction while remaining unaware of the much larger deception underneath. Crawford managed to maintain better relationships with his family, but the effort required constant vigilance and careful management of his emotions and reactions. Every family gathering, every casual conversation, every moment of relaxation carried the potential for an inadvertent revelation that could destroy everything he had worked to protect. As the 1990s approached, all three men found themselves trapped by the very success of their crime. The money and securities remained safely hidden, but the psychological and practical costs of maintaining their secret had grown beyond anything they had anticipated. They were wealthy on paper, but unable to access their wealth, successful in their careers but living in constant fear of discovery, and bound together by a shared secret that had become more burden than blessing. The advancement of computer technology and improved communication between law enforcement agencies created new anxieties about old crimes being re-examined with modern tools. Banking records that had once been stored only on paper were being digitized, creating searchable databases that could reveal patterns invisible to investigators in the 1970s. Financial tracking systems were becoming more sophisticated, making it increasingly difficult to convert stolen assets without triggering alerts. Crawford began researching the statute of limitations on federal crimes, hoping to find some timeline after which they might be safe from prosecution. What he discovered was discouraging. Major federal crimes like bank robbery carried no statute of limitations, meaning they could potentially be prosecuted decades after the fact if new evidence emerged. The only protection they had was the passage of time making investigation more difficult, but that same passage of time was also making their continued possession of stolen goods increasingly dangerous. By the early 2000s, the three conspirators had essentially stopped communicating entirely. The risks of contact outweighed any benefits, and each man had developed his own strategy for managing the ongoing burden of their shared secret. Mitchell had moved to a different state and taken early retirement, claiming health problems that weren't entirely fabricated. Chen had left government service and was working as a private financial consultant, still struggling with gambling addiction and the ongoing temptation to access his hidden assets. Crawford had remained in Atlanta and continued his government career, but the stress of guarding his secret was taking an increasingly severe toll on his health and family relationships. His basement vault had become both his greatest security and his greatest vulnerability, a constant reminder of the crime that had defined his life for over 3 decades. None of them could have predicted that the resolution to their carefully maintained secret would come not through law enforcement investigation or criminal betrayal, but through something as mundane as a failing furnace in the suburban home where Crawford had spent years perfecting his hiding place. The winter of 2009 was particularly harsh in Atlanta, with temperatures dropping well below normal and putting unusual strain on heating systems throughout the metropolitan area. Crawford's furnace, installed when he had first purchased the house in the 1970s, had been showing signs of age for several years. Strange noises, inconsistent heating, and rising energy bills had prompted his wife to suggest calling for professional service multiple times, but Crawford had always found excuses to delay. His reluctance wasn't entirely about cost or inconvenience. Any repair work in the basement created the risk that someone might notice irregularities in the construction, ask questions about the unusual wall configurations, or accidentally discover the hidden panels that concealed his vault. For years, he had managed to handle minor maintenance issues himself, or convince his wife that the problems weren't serious enough to warrant professional attention. But when the furnace failed completely during a particularly cold snap in February, delaying repair was no longer an option. The house was becoming uncomfortably cold, and his wife had begun making arrangements to stay with relatives until the heating system could be fixed. Crawford realized that refusing to allow repairs would create more suspicion than permitting them, so he reluctantly agreed to contact a local heating and cooling company. Crawford chose Reliable Heating and Cooling, a small family-owned business that had been serving the Decatur area for over 20 years. The company's reputation for discreet, professional service made them seem like the safest option. When he called to schedule the appointment, he specifically requested that the same technician handle the entire job, claiming he preferred consistency in service providers. What he really wanted was to limit the number of people who would have access to his basement. The technician assigned to the job was Marcus Williams, a methodical craftsman who had been working on residential heating systems since the early 1990s. Williams prided himself on thorough diagnostics and comprehensive repairs, often spending extra time to ensure that underlying issues were properly addressed, rather than simply patching obvious symptoms. His approach would prove to be exactly what Crawford had hoped to avoid. On the morning of February 18, 2009, Williams arrived at Crawford's modest 2-story colonial home, carrying his standard toolkit and diagnostic equipment. Crawford met him at the door, appearing unusually nervous for someone dealing with a routine furnace repair. He insisted on escorting Williams to the basement personally, explaining the layout of the house and pointing out various obstacles and storage areas that might interfere with the work. The basement was finished but cluttered, with decades of accumulated household items, holiday decorations, and what appeared to be an extensive workshop area along one wall. Williams noted that the space was unusually well organized for a storage basement, with everything carefully arranged and labeled. The furnace itself was located in a corner utility room that had been partially enclosed with drywall and acoustic panels. Williams began his diagnostic process by examining the furnace's external components, checking gas connections, electrical systems, and ventilation pathways. The unit was indeed old, but it had been meticulously maintained over the years. As he traced the ductwork throughout the basement, He noticed several irregularities in the construction that suggested modifications had been made long after the house was built. The most significant irregularity was a section of wall behind the workshop area, where the drywall didn't match the rest of the basement's finish. The seams were slightly different. The texture was inconsistent, and the electrical outlet seemed to have been added as an afterthought. Williams had seen enough basement renovations to recognize when construction had been done by an amateur rather than a professional contractor. Initially, these observations were simply professional curiosity. Many homeowners modified their basements over time, adding workshops, storage areas, or recreational spaces without following standard construction practices. But as Williams continued his examination of the heating system, he discovered that the ductwork had been deliberately routed around this particular wall section, creating an inefficient configuration that reduced airflow and put additional strain on the furnace motor. When Williams pointed out the airflow problem to Crawford, suggesting that relocating some of the ductwork would significantly improve the system's efficiency, Crawford's reaction was immediate and telling. He became visibly agitated, insisting that the current configuration was fine, and that he didn't want any modifications made to the existing layout. His nervousness increased dramatically when Williams suggested that improving the airflow might require accessing the space behind the workshop wall. Williams found Crawford's reaction unusual, but not unprecedented. Some homeowners were protective of their personal spaces or had storage arrangements they didn't want disturbed. He agreed to work within Crawford's constraints, focusing on repairing the furnace motor and replacing worn components without modifying the ductwork system. But as Williams worked throughout the morning, Crawford's behavior became increasingly erratic. He made frequent trips to the basement, ostensibly to check on the progress of the work, but actually to monitor Williams' activities and ensure he wasn't straying from the immediate furnace area. He asked detailed questions about what Williams was looking at, what he was touching, and how long each phase of the repair would take. Sometimes the most elaborate plans unravel through the simplest circumstances. Crawford's 36-year secret collapsed when Williams discovered loose acoustic panels concealing the vault entrance. Inside lay stacks of bearer bonds, gold coins, and cash that matched federal records from 1973. By evening, Crawford was in custody, leading investigators to Mitchell and Chen. The perfect heist had finally met its imperfect ending through nothing more than a broken furnace and one observant repair technician.